The internet is full of fake videos about ghost hunting, but unfortunately some of them are real, and in this video you will learn about a case that didn't end well. But first, if you're new here, remember to subscribe to the channel. The channel's goal is to get 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and I think we can achieve it. So please sign up. Now let's move on to the first story. I was a ghost hunter for just one day. Ghost hunters wanted, no experience necessary. That's what drew me to all this. That stupid ad. They even used the Ghostbusters logo. Totally illegal, of course, but it's a Facebook ad and who cares, right? The familiar logo caught my eye. The text made me laugh and I thought, sure, why not? And I clicked on their stupid ad. Past Owners, that was the name of their program. Well, program. It would be a YouTube channel, you know how it is, going into haunted properties, talking about the history. Get excited every time there is a squeak or a draft. Kiana was convinced she had a new angle, though, and it had nothing to do with ghosts. His hook was SEO and targeted marketing. She was fresh out of advertising school and was full of ideas about how to reach untapped markets and build a following. Her idea was this: even people who don't care about haunted houses generally care about haunted houses in their town, right? People like to hear about themselves, and their hometown is part of them enough to scratch that itch. Kiana was sure that through location-specific keywords and ads, we could pitch each episode of our show to locals, people who weren't already tired of the whole Ghostbusters thing. I was skeptical, but she was offering a regular salary, and it sounded like fun if nothing else. The no experience required in the ad was because she had already cast her videographer and technology staff. All she needed was a helper to do, well, everything else. And I had a big question for Kiana before I joined her. Do I have to believe in ghosts for this? She laughed. Definitely not. Only Emmerich does it, and nothing against him, but we don't need two Emmerichs around here, that's for sure. So I signed on as a van driver, cable carrier, coffee fetcher, and general doer. The team was small: Kiana, Mariti, two guys named Jeff, and Emmerich. Everyone seemed genuinely pleased to have me on the team, and I was happy to get to know them all, especially Mariti, who was hot as hell. She was the one who would be in front of the cameras, so it made sense. Plus, she had this accent. Man, it definitely convinced me that Kiana would be able to sell this show. That's all I'm saying. The Jeffs were in charge of the cameras. Everyone called them Stan Jeff and Sit Jeff to differentiate them. Stan Jeff was the guy who worked with the standard camera, the kind you carry around to film people. Sit Jeff handled all the remote cameras. Its entire business was run from one control center, keeping tabs on a dozen different screens at once. Different skill sets, both camera-based, both named Jeff. I asked Stan Jeff if we could call one of them by their middle name or something, and he looked disgusted. Yes, you could, except his middle name is Jeff. Wait, his name is Jeff? No, his name is Mark. He goes by Jeff, just to annoy me. He doesn't even respond to Mark now. If you don't call him Jeff, he pretends he didn't hear you. Well, do you have a middle name? Stan Jeff looked offended. Screw it! I won't let him steal my name. I was Jeff first. And then there was Emmerich. Everyone else was in their early 20s, I would say. Maybe 30 for Stan Jeff. But Emmerich had to have 50, and a worn-out 50 at that. He was a happy guy, always smiling. But he looked like he'd spent his entire life outdoors and only discovered sunscreen last week. His skin was aged and wrinkled like a broken baseball glove. His hair was short and bristly. He looked a little like Malcolm McDowell, only if he was a walnut. Emmerich was responsible for all the weird technology: EMF meters, infrared things, Geiger counter, defibrillator, regosser, don't name any of it. He lost me in 6 words. Anything weird that could catch a ghost. Emmerich had it and knew how to use it. Between its hard-sided suitcases and Sit Jeff's computer banks, the 12-passenger van barely had room for the 6 of us to sit. Do you think this thing can actually catch a ghost? I asked him. Another skeptic, I see. It means yes. People die all the time, everywhere. I really think I would have seen a ghost by now if they existed. Maybe you have. Not all hauntings are the same, you know? Have you ever felt someone watching you when you were alone? Or did your mood suddenly change for no reason? Are those your ghosts? They will make pretty bad TV. We were walking in the dark when this man suddenly got scared. Ooh. Emmerich was unfazed by my mockery. Some ghosts are smaller, some are bigger. If we're lucky, we'll find something in between. If we don't have it, my equipment is good enough to catch even the smallest ones. So the show can just be you pointing at a meter and explaining that this peak was a ghost? He shook his head vehemently. Trust me, we see a ghost. You won't need any explanation from me. Like I said, not all hauntings are the same. Your standard ghost is just a lost piece of a person. You might not even know it's there without some serious gear like mine. Temperature changes, tingling sensations. That's as far as a ghost can go. A ghost now is a complete evil place. It is a murder hallucinatory that bends space, dilates time, waiting to happen. Ghosts are sentient and sadistic. They will lure you in, chew you up, and swallow you whole. You see a ghost, drop everything and run if you still can. Emmerich was staring straight into my eyes. I opened my mouth to make a joke, but nothing came out. Verified, I said instead. I understood, noted. I didn't understand, of course. But on the other hand, Emmerich still showed up, so maybe even he didn't get it right back then. It was our first location. Kiana had found an amazing place outside of town, a full-blown mansion called the McDermott House. She had some kind of intense past, 150 years since old McDermott, his whole family, and crawled into the chimney. Ghosts haunted the attic and stared out the window forever. I don't know. I wasn't listening. I mean, I was listening, but Marette was reading, and so I was actually just listening to her accent and imagining other words. I kept the van on the right side of the road and got us to the McDermott house without incident, so whatever, I think I did well. The assembly was like montages. Emmerich, Sit Jeff, and I carried heavy things to various locations around the house and ran cables as discreetly as possible. Stan Jeff took several photos outside the house and then filmed Marette talking about the history of the place. Kiana helped Sit Jeff get everything up and running, supervised Stan Jeff's camera work for a while, and then probably took a nap or something. I don't know what producers do. She wasn't helping me carry the equipment, that's all I know. After everything was ready, we all left and went to a nearby pizzeria for dinner. Kiana wanted to wait until sunset to start, so we had dinner and jokes until dark, then headed home. Sit Jeff positioned himself behind his display of monitors and declared that everything was rolling and ready to go. Stan Jeff and Marette grabbed a thermometer and an EMF meter and went out to film in various rooms. Emmerich had me grab some of the more esoteric machines and follow him around to do probes or something. Kiana was alone, I thought at the time. Looking back, it was probably too late to save her. Emmerich and I were in the basement when my walkie-talkie started working. Here you are? Basement. Camera 4? I flashed my light at the wireless camera we had fixed to the wall earlier, reading the label. Yeah, 4. No. The walkie-talkie in and out erratically, hissing with static. Something there, but I shined my light at the camera again. See the bright light? It's us. There was nothing but static coming out of the walkie-talkie, so I took a picture of the camera and texted it to Sit Jeff. Moments later, my phone buzzed with a response. It was a photo of the camera banks centered on the monitor labeled Camera 4. It showed an empty room in the basement, the same one we were in. I looked at Emmerich's machines, which were completely silent. Emmerich was bouncing off the walls. We were both completely visible to the camera. Ha ha, I answered. Previous photo. Very funny. Message me if something is really going on. On the walkie-talkie, I said, the basement is looking quiet. Stand up, Jeff, Marette. Something going on where you are? Climb up, said a voice on the walkie. It didn't look like any of the Jeffs, and it definitely didn't look like Kiana or Marette. Jeff, is that you? Underneath, I looked at Emmerich, who shrugged. Nothing down here, he said. We were almost out of the basement when Emmerich stopped. How many steps were there on the way down, he said. I don't know, like 10, 12? Now there are 13. Okay, so there were 13. What, is that an unlucky number of steps? I don't think there were 13 on the way down. Man, if there are 13 steps going up, there were 13 going down. That's how stairs work. It wasn't 13, he said stubbornly, shaking his head. I sighed and walked past him. The ground floor was quiet. I thought about screaming, but something held me back. Instead, I picked up the walkie again. What room are you in? Underneath. Up there, then? We're back on the ground floor. Above. Thanks, man. Useful. I turned to Emmerich. Get up then. He looked worried. I want to change some equipment. Back in the main room, the chair in front of the bank of monitors was empty. Emmerich and I exchanged glances. Sit down, Jeff, I said into the walkie-talkie. Where did you go, man? I'm with the others. Climb. Okay, I said uncertainly, looking at the monitors. I couldn't see anyone on any of the screens. Emmerich is just picking up a few things. Come and join us. Okay, yes, we are already arriving. I shivered as Emmerich placed a small box in my hand. What? I started to say, but he pressed 2 fingers to my lips. For the first time since I met him, he wasn't smiling. He patted the box in my hand, which had a post-it note on it. Turn this on to the maximum, he said. The box had a single dial, like a car radio button. It had 2 rubber antennas coming out of the top, and its back was a single speaker. I gave him a questioning look. If you need to, he told me, not before. I do not think... Emmerich put his fingers in my mouth again. With his other hand, he pointed to the unlit front hallway. In the dim light, at first I couldn't see what he was pointing at. Then with a shock, I realized the front door was gone. The large wooden door, with its semicircle of leaded glass above and rectangular panes on each side, was no longer there. Instead, the hallway ended in a small alcove with a chair, lamp, and end table. It would have looked like a really cozy reading nook if I hadn't known that it was supposed to be the way we entered the house. I tried, but he pressed his hand against me harder, crushing my lips with his teeth. The walkie clicked and came back to life. Climb. Let's go up, said Emmerich. He held up a box identical to the one he handed me and looked at it meaningfully, then back at me. They are waiting for us. Together we climbed the narrow staircase of the house. I counted the steps this time. There were 13. The stairs led to a dark hallway lined with doors. All were closed. An aura of menace hung in the air, an almost palpable sensation. I could feel it settling in my lungs with each breath. I tried the first door. It was locked. Emmerich tried the one across the hall with the same result. I glanced down. The steps stretched into darkness far beyond the reach of my light. Up, said the walkie-talkie. At the end of the hallway, a set of folding stairs led to a massive hole in the ceiling. I gave Emmerich a pleading look. He grabbed his small plastic box and walked towards the stairs. With fear in my heart, I followed him. The attic was dusty, black and silent. Our lights barely seemed to pierce the air, illuminating mere meters in front of us. A splintered wooden floor stretched beneath protruding beams. Discarded boxes and furniture were scattered erratically. Oh, that's good, said a voice. It came from the walkie, but also from above, behind, and from all sides. You came to join us. The walls rose then, spitting out darkness with tangible form. I dove for the stairs, fully willing to fall headfirst down them, but instead, I skidded on the wooden planks. New. Laughter echoed as I stood up, desperately looking for an exit that was no longer there. Behind me, heavy footsteps echoed across the floor and static crackled. What? No, no, shouted a facsimile of Sit Jeff's voice, and I turned around but saw nothing. Instead, a hand caressed the side of my cheek, and I heard Morette's soft voice in my ear. We were waiting for you. A rough hand grabbed my other shoulder then, spinning me away. Get up! Move! Shouted Emmerich, pulling me to my feet. He dragged me through the attic, our footsteps muffled by the cacophony of voices shouting around us. Ghost hands grabbed my arms and clawed at my face, but Emmerich's presence was more solidly real than any of them. Was there a window in the attic? What? I don't know. Perhaps... Think! Emmerich towed me in a circle, the attic closing in around us. When we first arrived here, it stretched out in all directions. Now we were tripping over boxes with every step, and I could see all 4 walls in a flash of light. When we arrived, did you see a window? A dormer window in the house? A circular panel at the top? It doesn't need to open, it just needs to be there. Think! The walls were closer now, no more than 2 steps away. They were closing in, forming a coffin. There are no windows. There were no windows, there were no doors, there was no escape. No, it is. Era had 1 window. I didn't... And then a piece of memory caught my attention, a piece of the house's history that Marete was reading in the car. The ghost had been seen in the attic window. I was sure of it, sure that she had said it. Yes. Yes. Towards the street, an attic window. Then run! And with that, Emmerich pushed me away from him, dropping his flashlight to turn the dial on its little plastic case to its maximum. As the feedback screamed at a painfully deafening volume, the walls around us shook, and for just an instant I could see moonlight streaming through a window. I ran towards her, turning the knob on my own box loudly. An electronic scream came out, holding the walls as I physically dove for the window, breaking it into the open night 25 feet above the ground. I don't know how I survived the fall. The ground was soft enough and I fell. Okay, I suppose. If you count 3 broken ribs, a broken ankle, and a broken elbow, well, anyway, I feel. I didn't even feel my bones creaking until I was back in the van, sticking the keys in the ignition and slamming my broken ankle into the gas pedal to get away. And yet I didn't stop until the McDermott house was miles behind me and my body was screaming at me to stop and rest. That was almost a month ago. I don't know what happened to the others, not exactly. I saw Emmerich at the end as I fell through the air. He looked stretched, broken, his limbs bent at unpleasant angles and his skin stretched until it began to tear in places. But it was the look on his face that is etched in my mind, a look of horror, hopelessness, and horrible understanding all rolled into one. It was the look of a man who knows in terrifying detail everything that is about to happen, and understands that knowing won't make it hurt any less. I wonder if he knew he was saving me at his own expense, or if he thought the window was in the other direction and was trying to offer me the house while he threw himself for safety. I don't sleep much anymore, minutes at a time, maybe half an hour if I'm lucky, or bad luck perhaps, because every time I sleep I'm back at the McDermott house. Voices taunt me, bubbling up from the darkness. Hands grab my body, pulling me back. Hallways stretch out as I run through them, lifting doors out of my reach. And always, always the whisper, "Did you really think I would let you go?" I think I managed to get out in time. I remember the glass on my skin from the impact with the ground. I can feel the hard casts on my arm and leg, bite my finger for the pain, peel off a scab to watch myself bleed. I'm sure I'm here. But then again, that's exactly the kind of hope the house would like me to have. Alien abductions are real, and they're worse than you think. Most of you reading this report will not believe my story. Damn, I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't experienced the horror. As far as I know, only 2 people survived that hell and returned to Earth in one piece, and unfortunately the other is no longer alive. As for me, I was warned by government processes of the serious consequences that would follow if I ever went public with my incredible and frightening story. But I decided to do it anyway because I believe people need to know what's really out there, and I fear the truth will soon become apparent, as a intergalactic is coming to our doorstep. Like most abduction victims, I am nobody special or important. In fact, I was on the lowest rung of society, a destitute who had fallen on hard times losing my job, my home, and falling victim to an alcohol addiction, sleeping rough and filling my belly with cheap vodka to keep me warm at night. My admission of having an alcohol problem will certainly call my account into question, but I can assure you that I was quite sober when the events I will describe took place. On the night in question, I took refuge in an abandoned bus shelter along a lonely country road, falling asleep under the stars after emptying my bottle. I don't know what time I woke up, but I vividly remember my senses being simultaneously overloaded, my ears ringing with a deafening buzz, and my eyes temporarily blinded by a bright white light. Suddenly and inexplicably, I felt my body lifting off the bench, my form being pulled upward toward the night sky. My last memory was of the dark cigar-shaped aircraft in the sky above me, and to my horror I realized I was being pulled towards it. But then I felt myself losing consciousness, my eyes closing as my entire world went black. I woke up an indeterminate amount of time later in a very strange place, literally. The first thing I noticed was the pain I felt throughout my body, a dull throbbing as my bones and joints ached simultaneously. I soon discovered that I was completely not. My clothes were gone as I lay against the cold metal, my skin freezing and my body shaking. It caused me physical pain to open my eyes, but when I did, There was little I could see because the steel-lined room was dark, only dimly lit by a faint red light. It was at this point that I panicked, standing quickly on my shaky legs towards the wall. But I didn't get very far as I suddenly felt a sharp pain pulsing through my body, feeling like I had just been struck by lightning. I screamed in agony, falling to the cold, hard ground as I reached for my throat and was horrified to find a metal collar attached around my neck. In an act of desperation and panic, I pulled on the collar, trying to remove it, but I was hit by another wave of electricity that shot through me. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," shouted a male voice from the darkness, his tone surprisingly calm given the circumstances. "The shock collar is programmed to if you make any sudden movements or if you try to remove it. The voltage will constantly increase until you lose consciousness or your heart stops." I felt a rush of emotions upon hearing his words, confusion, anger, and fear. But I listened to the stranger's advice, not wanting to go through that pain again. I slowly opened my dry lips and stuttered my words. "Who are you? And what the hell is this place?" "My name is Gideon, and I am like you, a prisoner here." "Is anybody else there?" I asked cautiously. "Yes," came the first response, this time from a frightened female voice. "I'm Tanya, and I don't know why I'm here." There was a pause before the next voice called out from the darkness, his voice shaking as he spoke. "Max? I'm Max. I don't know why this is happening. I want to go home." "I'm sure we all do," Gideon replied, "but unfortunately that's not going to happen." I shook my head, figuring this must be some kind of vivid nightmare, but in my heart I knew it was real. "You did not answer my question," I added as my fear began to turn into anger. "Where the hell are we, and who did this to us?" I heard Gideon scoff before he responded. "Well, technically it's two questions, but I'm happy to help, although I suspect you might not like the answers. It's hard to explain in words, so maybe it'll be easier if I show it to everyone." I heard footsteps and saw the shape of a man slowly walking across the metal floor and towards the adjacent wall. He tapped a hidden control panel with his bony fingers and entered a code, and suddenly a mechanism started and a shutter slowly opened, revealing a scene that brought terror to my heart. Because when the shutter finally opened, we all saw a transparent, porthole-like window looking out, showing a dark sky adorned with distant stars and a blue and green globe that we all recognized very well. I slowly stood up, ignoring the throbbing pain in my body. Not as he walked barefoot to the window and watched the scene in disbelief, examining the contours of the familiar green continents, the mighty blue oceans, and the shifting storm fronts that swept the globe. To my horror, I realized that I was looking at Earth, which could only mean one thing. I was no longer on my home planet. Light reflected from the Earth's surface now illuminated the room in which we were imprisoned, a metal cell. New, with few visible amenities other than a stinking hole in the floor that I assumed was supposed to be a bathroom and hard concrete slabs for beds. I also saw my fellow prisoners clearly for the first time. Tanya and Max showed up like me, humiliated and beaten, their eyes filled with terror as they saw what I saw. Clearly they were both in shock. I tried to maintain their dignity by focusing on their faces instead of their shapes new. Tanya was a young woman, thin, dark, and attractive, although I recognized the telltale signs of addiction in her, like pale skin, red eyes, and track marks on her arms. Max was an older man, his physique sagging and skin wrinkled. I saw a raw terror in his wide eyes that made me think he was on the verge of a psychological breakdown. Gideon was different, however. I noticed he was wearing a shock collar like the rest of us, but he was also fully clothed, wearing a white robe that covered his dignity. True, he didn't appear to be in the best of health, his body emaciated and eyes grim, as if they had seen too many horrors. It was also clear that he knew more about our situation than the rest of us. I wasn't the only one to come to this conclusion as soon everyone turned to the mysterious Gideon. "How the hell did you know about that shutter?" I demanded. Gideon raised his hands defensively as he responded, "I can explain everything. Just give me a chance." "Nonsense!" Max shouted angrily. "You're kidding us, man." "Yeah," Tanya agreed. "How do we know you weren't the one who did this to us? Why the hell should we trust you?" In an instant, the three of us were charging toward Gideon, our fists clenched as we prepared to beat the shit out of him. Gideon's eyes widened, and he raised his hands higher, slowly backing away as he said, "You shouldn't do that." "Hey," I shouted as I threw myself forward. But a second later, I was on the ground, my body convulsing as the shock collar delivered another agonizing shock. I looked to see my two companions, equally incapacitated, both rolling on the metal surface in agony. When our punishment was over, we all looked up, seeing Gideon watching us with a barely concealed look of smug satisfaction on his lips. "I warned you," he said. Slowly and painfully, I stood up, and my fellow prisoners did the same as we looked to Gideon for answers. "My friends," he began, "as I have already explained, I am a prisoner here, just like the three of you. It turns out that our captors allowed me certain privileges and access to limited information. Why, I cannot say, although I suspect it is part of their plan for me to explain the situation to the newcomers." My mind was racing, sweat dripping off my skin. None of this made sense. "I don't understand," Tanya asked, breaking the tense, confused silence. "Who did this to us? Who the hell is holding us back? And where the hell are we?" Gideon nodded before responding. "Where we are should be obvious, although I understand it is a lot to take in. However, we are clearly in space above our home planet. As for who's holding us back, well, that's harder to explain. Our captors are not of this world. I assume they come from another star system in our galaxy, although from where exactly I can't say. They shared little with me about their culture or civilization. I just know that your technology is far superior to ours." "So what are you saying? We were abducted by aliens from shit?" I exclaimed in shocked disbelief. "That's exactly what I'm saying," Gideon confirmed grimly. "Alien abduction," Tanya interrupted excitedly. "What, do you mean anal probing and all that?" Max let out a nervous laugh, but Gideon didn't share the joke and his face remained impassive. "I fear it is much worse than that," he said solemnly. "They have no interest in human anatomy, except for the purposes of inflicting physical pain on us." A shiver ran down my spine as I asked, "What the hell do you mean?" Gideon didn't respond immediately, instead pointing and directing our attention back to the porthole. I turned my head to look, instantly sickened by the horror I witnessed, as first one and then a second human body slowly floated through space and passed by the window, their bodies noose frozen in cold vacuum. The first was a man, the second a woman, and both bodies showed obvious signs of with deep incisions made in the meat, burn marks on the skin and fingers of the hands. His bulging eyes, they were still open, filled with the pain and terror of his final moments. We all watched in amazement and shock as the bodies disappeared from sight, lost forever in the cruel void of space. "My God," I muttered, my entire body shaking with revulsion as I slowly backed away from the porthole. "The last batch," Gideon explained solemnly. "Our captors finished them off." I struggled to force the words out of my throat. "They tortured them first and then threw their bodies into space. Why? Why would they do that?" "Well, that's the $1,000 question, isn't it?" Gideon responded cryptically. "I don't have all the answers, but I've been on this ship for a while. I observed what occurs and had some limited communication with our captors, receiving as much information as a master would provide to his slave. From this, I came to some conclusions. All living organisms are a product of their environment, and the characteristics they develop allow them to survive in that environment. The problem with evolution is that it's hard to get rid of. We humans consider ourselves an advanced and civilized species, but we are still prone to primitive and animalistic impulses. Now imagine a species that evolved on a planet much more dangerous than ours, an environment populated by many highly aggressive organisms, where the evolutionary winner would need to be smarter, stronger, and more ruthless than its competitors to end up on top. Fast forward a few millennia, and this species is now technologically advanced and capable of intergalactic space travel. It encounters other similarly developed civilizations, and inevitably, there is conflict, terrible battles fought in star systems resulting in countless deaths. Gideon paused briefly as he looked out the porthole and toward our distant planet. It would be safe to say that we were all hanging on his every word, even though the implications of what he was telling us were extraordinary and terrifying. Eventually, these end in stalemate, as various civilizations fight each other to a standstill. A new order emerges, a sort of galactic UN formed to maintain peace. A war, he finished. However, our captors still have the same predatory instincts, a remnant of their violent evolution. So what do they do with these urges? Well, they come to a place like Earth, an isolated and remote planet on the edge of the galaxy, beyond the laws of the Galactic Confederation. Here they can kidnap with impunity, taking those who will not be missed and inflicting sadistic attacks on them before brutally ending their lives. By such underhanded methods, our captors can satisfy their dark impulses without risking a war with their galactic rivals. I shook my head in dismay, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of this madness. In the end, it was Tanya who vocalized what we all must have been thinking. So you're saying these psychopaths are like space versions of Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, like they travel light years just to target his people? Gideon frowned before responding. Well, it's a little more complicated than that, but in a nutshell, yes, that's the situation. I couldn't believe it. My exhausted brain told me that this couldn't be true, and even if it was, there had to be a way out. And what do we do? I asked frantically. How do we get out of this hell? Gideon sighed loudly before responding. Not you, I'm afraid. There's no escaping this ship, and there is no way for you to avoid your fate. All of you will be here. Unfortunately, this is inevitable. Bullshit, I shouted in angry defiance. That can't be true. Did you survive? Why don't you? Our captors keep me alive because I serve their purposes, at least for now. I suspect they will when I'm no longer useful. Or maybe they're just saving me for last. Either way, I have accepted that I will never leave this ship alive. Suddenly, all of our attention was drawn to the corner of the cell where Max was curled up in the fetal position, shaking his head frantically back and forth as he muttered in a state of disconnected panic. No, 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 this can't be happening. This can't be real. I shouldn't be here. I do not deserve this. I shouldn't be here. A moment later, the far wall lit up when suddenly a previously hidden door appeared and opened. They are coming to claim their first victim, Gideon warned, fear now evident in his voice. We all backed away from the door, trying to prepare ourselves for whatever monstrosity loomed on the other side. But Max had lost his temper, getting up and trying to run to the door, shouting, "Let me out of here! I need to get out!" He moved quickly before any of us had time to react. What happened next was a violent blur in my memory as a long instrument reached out from the darkness and struck Max hard in the head, sending him backwards and onto the metal floor. The creature that emerged from the shadows and entered our cell looked like something out of a nightmare. My descriptive skills aren't good enough to do the alien being justice, but the best way I can describe the beast's appearance is a cross between a human and a velociraptor. The alien stood about 7 feet tall, its body covered in red scales, though it also wore Kevlar-like body armor over its torso. Its snout-like mouth was full of sharp fangs, and its dark eyes were those of a reptile, cold, calculating, and predatory. Its arms were relatively short and stocky compared to the rest of its body, but I noticed that the beast had opposable thumbs and fingers, which meant it was able to hold and direct the weapon spear-like in her claws, the same metal rod she used to attack poor Max. Its legs, on the other hand, looked powerful, and I saw that its middle fingers were adorned with sharp, curved claws about 6 inches long. He tapped those claws menacingly on the metal floor as he watched us, his human victims, new and defenseless. At this point, Max unfortunately regained consciousness, looking up at the beast above him and screaming in absolute terror. I swore I could see a cruel smile play across the alien's lips, his eyes widening with sadistic pleasure as he raised his head. Weapon. A second later, Max's limp body was dragged roughly across the floor, his shock collar acting like a magnet that latched onto the tip of the alien's metal spear, allowing him to easily pull the kicking and screaming Max out of the cell and into the dark corridor beyond. A moment later, the door slammed shut, leaving a trail of And Max urinated on the floor, and the rest of us were trapped inside, dealing with the shock of what we had just witnessed. "My God, what are they going to do with him?" Tanya asked with a trembling voice. "Trust me, you don't want to know," Gideon responded. I sat in a corner with my head in my hands as I desperately tried to think. Surely there must be a way out, I thought. This couldn't be the end. But things only got worse over the next few hours. Clearly, our captors enjoyed tormenting us because although the cell walls were thick, they deliberately made sound using some kind of speaker system. And what we heard were our companion Max's screams and pleas as he was subjected to the unspeakable. We hear every scream ignored for mercy, every incision made in your cheers, and a dirty hissing sound that I can only assume is the equivalent of reptilian alien laughter. Our reactions upon hearing this monstrous cacophony were different in each case. Tanya broke down as she lay in a corner and sobbed uncontrollably while Gideon stood and listened in grim silence, as clearly he had been through this hellish situation many times before. As for me, my mind was on the verge of madness, and I wanted to rip my ears off so I wouldn't have to listen to Max's suffering. I kept racking my brain, trying to think of a way out and demanding answers from Gideon. But he didn't give me the answers I needed as the veteran prisoner seemed resigned to his fate. "We can fight the motherfuckers. Of course we can," I shouted. Gideon shook his head. "You are not unarmed," and has a shock collar attached to his neck. What's more, we're aboard their spaceship, surrounded by dozens of guards. Armed it is. Resistance is completely futile. Believe me, many have tried and all have failed. "Well, can't we reason with them then?" I asked desperately. "Are you able to communicate with these aliens? Can't we make a deal?" Gideon scoffed at the suggestion. "Reason with them? Our captors consider us no better than insects. They wouldn't trade with us any sooner than we would with a common housefly." "Well, there must be something we can do," I shouted angrily, raising my voice to be heard over Max's screams. "We can't just sit here and wait for the death." "Don't you think I would have done something by now?" Gideon shouted, as if for the first time he had lost his temper. "Don't you realize that I considered every possible option?" "Shut up!" shouted Tanya as she lifted her tear-streaked face from her hands. "Shut up, you two! This isn't helping. Jesus Christ, a man is dying in the next room. Show him some damn respect." His angry words of reprimand ended our debate, and soon after the screams of Max are gone, replaced by a rattle. Horrifying when he finally left the shroud. I shuddered when I heard that horrible sound. I felt some relief that Max's suffering was over, but also fear, because I knew one of us would be next. Sure enough, it wasn't long before the invisible door in the wall reopened, and the 7-foot-tall reptilian guard entered, his claws clicking with excitement as his predatory eyes scanned the inside of the cell for his next victim. I stood up in defiance, clenching my fists as I glared at the beast. I knew that any physical resistance would be futile, but I still wanted to go down fighting. But the alien's cold eyes ignored me, instead focusing on Tanya and raising her hand. As he advanced on her, I experienced a moment of reckless bravery at that moment. As I charged towards the guard, shouting, "No, don't take her! Take me instead!" The alien's reaction was instantaneous as he hit me with his spear. A sharp pain reverberated through my skull as I fell to the ground. With me out of the way, the alien guard continued his advance on Tanya, who had taken shelter in the far corner of the cell. It seemed inevitable that the beast would take her, but then all hell broke loose. There was a powerful explosion and the entire ship shook, throwing us all around the cell like helpless rag dolls. This included the alien guard, who was thrown heavily against the wall, his head cracking on impact. The alien didn't get up. I don't know if he was dead or just unconscious, but either way, we are happy for our unexpected salvation. At that moment, we all turned to the porthole, surprised to see a second ship flying through space. A silver, needle-shaped ship that was firing as it sped toward us, missiles through the void. There were more explosions as the prison ship we were aboard shook under the force of multiple impacts. "Who the hell is this?" I shouted, looking to Gideon for answers. For the first time, the veteran hostage looked as surprised and perplexed as we did. "I have no idea. I've never seen a ship like this before," he answered honestly. Tanya brought us back to reality, shouting, "Come on, Doug, we need to get out of here." She pointed to the incapacitated body of the alien guard and the still open door, offering us an escape from the cell. Tanya led the way and I followed. Gideon paused only briefly, taking one last look around the hellish prison before leaving it behind. We exited and found ourselves navigating a maze of dark corridors as explosions continued to rock the alien ship. Our collars, thankfully, did not transmit a shock, for which we were all grateful. I can only assume the explosions disrupted their signal. Gideon soon moved on, as he seemed to know the way. He took us to a second room, entering a code to open the door. What we found inside was a hellish scene beyond my worst nightmares. It seemed like this was the room to aliens, stinking of blood and disinfectant. I saw shelves of primitive blades and high-tech surgical devices that I assumed were designed for the sole purpose of inflicting physical pain. And as we advanced through the hideous room, we saw what was left of poor Max, his body strapped to a medical gurney, with his wrists and ankles bound, and his chest open to reveal his rib cage and internal organs, while his face was frozen in a mask. Grim mortuary. A silent but permanent scream on his lips as a chilling reminder of his agonizing final moments. "Jesus," I cursed as I looked at his mutilated corpse, realizing how lucky we were to avoid the same fate. "Get out, shit! What the hell?" Tanya suddenly exclaimed, her voice once again filled with shock and disgust. I looked at the far wall of the room and witnessed pure horror. There, mounted in a macabre display, were the severed heads of the aliens' many victims. Most were human, but there were other species too, exotic and unknown to my eyes. One looked like some kind of aquatic creature, complete with gills and scales, while another looked similar to a werewolf, except it had 6 eyes. In total, there were about a dozen heads mounted on the wall, but that wasn't even the worst thing about the sadistic display. What chilled Tanya and I to the core was the fact that the severed heads were still alive. I don't know how they did it or what kind of bad, twisted science they used, but each head was connected by tubes to some kind of digital electronic device that appeared to be monitoring its vital signs. Each head seemed to be trapped in its own never-ending hellish nightmare. Some stared at us with bloodshot eyes, filled with madness, while others maniacally opened and closed their mouths in an attempt to scream, except that no sound came out, as presumably they no longer had vocal cords. And some of the heads had been subjected to even worse torment, their eyes removed and their mouths sewn shut, although they still smelled the air and reacted to sounds, the result being the most grotesque and disgusting sight I have ever witnessed. "Ah, yes, sorry," Gideon added in a meek voice. "I should have warned you about your hunting trophies. They use their technology to keep the brains alive, allowing these selected victims to continue to feel pain and fear. Unfortunately, most of these poor souls lost their minds a long time ago." I shook my head, amazed at the almost flippant way in which Gideon described these atrocities. I realized, however, that he must have lived through hell, suffering unspeakable horrors at the hands of our sadistic alien captors. I couldn't imagine what he had to do just to survive on this ship of nightmares. As we stared in horror at the living heads, Gideon went to work, tapping a control panel to reveal bizarre symbols that I imagine were texts engraved in the alien language, and images that appeared to show the inside of the ship. He frowned as he tapped the screen, obviously frustrated with what he was seeing. "I know there are escape pods on this ship. I heard them talk about emergency evacuation procedures." He pointed to the ship's map, drawing our attention to an area at the rear of the ship shaped like a cigar. "They should be located here, but I don't know how we got to them. And even if we do, I have no idea how to operate the capsules, much less navigate one back to Earth." Tanya and I shared a look of despair, realizing that we had come this far only to face yet another obstacle. But Gideon was a defeated man, resigned to failure and defeat. He never thought we'd make it this far, and I knew we couldn't give up now. Where there is a will, there is a way. As we considered our next move, fate once again intervened, as suddenly the door to the room exploded and something entered through the smoke and fire. We prepared for the worst, But what confronted us was something new. A hovering, drone-like robot with two extending mechanical arms, both adorned with high-tech weaponry. It also had a camera-type device attached to its main body, a pitch-black circle silently observing us as if analyzing our physical forms or perhaps scanning our brain waves. I looked to Gideon for an explanation, only to find a look of bewilderment on his face. Clearly, he had no idea what this entity was or whether it meant us harm. A tense moment passed as the hovering robot continued to watch us, before suddenly a green light flashed on its visible display. And to our surprise, the robot spoke to us in near-perfect English. "Greetings, citizens of Earth. Please don't be scared. I am Unit 2317, an autonomous artificial intelligence combat drone attached to the SS Righteous Fury, the Confederation tasked with hunting down and neutralizing pirate vessels operating in violation of galactic law. You are all victims of a criminal conspiracy undertaken by a rogue faction involved in illegal hunting operations. Our primary mission is to eliminate rogue hunters, but we are also tasked with rescuing any survivors and, when possible, returning them to their homeworlds. Now I will free you from your restraints." In an instant, all of our shock collars disconnected and fell from our necks, presumably deactivated by some sort of electronic countermeasure. We all felt great relief at being free, even though we were still a long way from home. "Please follow me and I will escort you to a safe zone," said the AI drone. The three of us looked at each other confused. I certainly didn't feel comfortable trusting a robot from another planet, but I thought Unit 2317 was a better bet than our reptilians. We exited through the demolished door and fled into the maze of hallways, following the hovering drone as it led the way. Meanwhile, the chaos of battle was all around us as the alien ship was attacked by Confederate forces. We had just turned a corner when we were confronted by a reptilian soldier armed with some kind of high-tech rifle. He growled before taking aim, raising his weapon and preparing to shoot, but the machine reacted faster. Up quickly released a series of dart-like projectiles that tore the alien's body into pieces. We walked over his body and continued our escape, observing scenes of violence as other drones faced reptilian aliens in mortal combat. The fighting was fierce, but it seemed clear that the AI drones were winning, while our alien captors were being gradually eliminated and their invaded. Finally, we reached what I guessed was the back of the spaceship, where we saw a row of circular doors with strange symbols written above them and control panels on the metal walls next to them. "The escape pods, we achieved!" Gideon exclaimed, his eyes shining with hope for the first time since I met him. Our robotic savior extended a mechanical arm and began pressing buttons on the first control panel. "Destination Earth, location North American continent. Your pod will leave in 2 of your minutes." A moment later, the door opened, revealing the cramped but inviting compartment inside. "Thank God," Tanya proclaimed happily. "Please proceed inside," instructed the robot. Tanya jumped without hesitation, and I followed, stopping only briefly to look back at the third member of our group. To my amazement, I saw that Gideon was standing behind the pod door. "What are you doing?" I asked in dismay. "No. I'm sorry, my friends, I can't go with you. It's too late for me. Do you understand? The things I saw, what I had to do to survive. I can't return to Earth after all this. There must be a price." There were tears in his old eyes, and I could tell his soul was hurting. I struggled to find the words to persuade him, but there was no time. Suddenly, a trio of warriors reptilians charged down the hallway toward us, wildly as they came. Gideon shouted, physically pushing me into the pod and slamming his palm against the controls to close the door. I was sealed inside before I knew what was happening, watching helplessly through the porthole window as Gideon fled and 2317 laid down covering fire, engaging the attackers in deadly combat. The battle was intense but brief as the robotic drone eventually succumbed to overhead fire, exploding in a fireball before us. The aliens advanced on our pod with weapons fist, and for a second I feared all was lost, but then the counter reached 0 and our pod was launched, a huge blast of energy propelling us into space at tremendous speed. "Oh shit, Tanya repeated as we were hurled through the dark void. I held on tight and continued to look through the porthole, seeing the reptilian ship getting smaller and smaller in the distance. I observed several small objects ejected from the ship, which must have been more AI drones escaping the doomed ship. And then a moment later, the ship of exploded from the inside out, its shape torn apart by white flames when the nightmare ended. I watched the debris scattering through space and shed a tear for Gideon, believing we would never have escaped that deadly trap without the knowledge he imparted to us. Tanya, on the other hand, was focused on the view in front of us as our pod quickly approached the Earth's surface. "Look, we're going home," she exclaimed. "We'll make it after all." She smiled sweetly at me, and for a moment I shared her joy. But we soon experienced the trauma of atmospheric re-entry, our little pod burning up as the ground quickly approached. I was sure we would crash into the surface in a crescendo of fire, but at the last moment the pod engaged reverse thrusters, reducing our speed and allowing us to land relatively gently on the ground, though not without a bump. A moment later the pod doors opened automatically, and we were able to breathe fresh air for the first time. And boy, was it amazing. Cautiously, Tanya and I exit the alien ship, finding ourselves in the middle of a flat cornfield, seemingly without another soul in sight. I watched the scene. Part of me still didn't believe we were truly free. "Okay, now what?" Tanya asked as she approached me, her still bare skin glowing in the morning sun. We soon got our answer with the heavy whine of rotor blades when suddenly a black helicopter appeared on the horizon, approaching quickly until it was practically hovering over our heads. We looked up in bewildered confusion before seeing movement on the road at the edge of the cornfield as a fleet of dark SUVs sped toward the spot and a small army of federal agents jumped out, all pointing weapons to Tanya and I as they ordered us to get down on the floor. Then the feds arrested us, placing us in custody, while they took possession of the alien escape pod, the only tangible evidence of the incident. We were held for days and interrogated separately, ordered to report the details of our abduction and captivity. I don't know why they released us. I don't think we had committed any crimes, but we were warned not to talk about what we went through or we would face severe consequences. Obviously, I have now decided to disregard that warning and tell my story publicly for the first time. Why did I make this decision? Well, I suspect my days are numbered. See, I got the news recently that Tanya suddenly overdosed. She had a history of abuse of substances, so it's possible she started using again to deal with her PTSD after the kidnapping. But I'm not so sure I believe that. I wonder if Tanya was deliberately silenced by some shadowy government agency that wants to cover up the truth. If that's the case, they'll definitely come after me next. Clearly, our government knows much more about these abductions than it is willing to share with the public. However, I doubt they can keep this secret much longer. Not if a galactic civil war is happening in our own solar system. In any case, such is the enormous gap in technology. I doubt there is much we can do to change the outcome of this conflict. A war. It's coming to us, and we better pray that the good guys win, because I've seen evil in the universe, and believe me, it's scary. SOS. I'm trapped aboard an alien ship at the edge of our solar system. We're running out of time. I know someone will receive this transmission. Sooner or later, our signal will reach one of the parties involved in this conflict. My only hope is that whoever is listening is able and willing to send help, and that they can reach us before our enemies do. My story is incredible and may be considered a fraud by some, but there are those in a position of power on Earth who know the terrible truth, even if they have gone to incredible lengths to cover it up. As for me, I don't know how I was dragged into this living hell, but I fought so hard that I refused to just give up. Let me start from the beginning. My story will be sadly familiar to many. I served in the military and saw combat, only to return home with PTSD, an addiction problem, and no support network. Like so many others, I fell through the cracks in society as my demons destroyed my life and left me living in poor conditions on the streets. I guess that's why they targeted me. Unlike most of the other victims, I do not remember the circumstances of my kidnapping. I think I was totally out of it when they took me, so I avoided the well-documented blinding lights and the feeling of being pulled up by an alien tractor beam. Hell, for all I know, I was taken by an agent of some shady organization and willingly handed over to these animals. Frankly, I don't know which is worse. The first thing I remember is waking up naked on cold metal, my head hurting as a dull pain reverberated through my skull. I groggily opened my eyes and stood up, finding myself trapped inside a small, featureless, steel windowless cell lit by a dim red light above me. I tried not to panic, although that wasn't easy. I struggled to control my breathing and fought hard to avoid having an anxiety attack, instead focusing on my surroundings. I searched my cell, finding a set of ill-fitting white robes neatly folded on the floor in front of me. I was suspicious but also freezing from the cold, so I decided to dress in the clothes provided. Feeling a little more confident, I placed my hands on the cold metal walls of my cell, feeling blindly for a door or exit. I considered asking for help, but quickly decided against it as I figured whoever had done this didn't have good intentions towards me. To my immense frustration, I couldn't find a way out. And then I started to panic. I found it better to breathe as my chest tightened and my head was filled with terrible visions. My imagination went wild as I considered why I was here and who was holding me back. I lay down on the cold metal and placed my head in my hands, but was suddenly startled by a hissing sound as a previously invisible door slid open, revealing a bright hallway beyond my cramped cell. Slowly and cautiously, I left the waiting room and walked towards the passage, jumping when the door closed automatically behind me. I continued barefoot along the metal walkway, feeling increasingly uncomfortable as I explored. The narrow, dimly lit hallway was devoid of any color or natural light. Austere and featureless, I was reminded of the interior of a ship, war, or submarine. Listening closely, I thought I heard the soft hum of distant engines, although I couldn't be sure. However, I had a terrible feeling as I slowly advanced. I was sure I was being watched, and I wondered what my captors wanted with me. When I reached the end of the hallway, I discovered a T-junction with two seemingly identical hallways before me, one going left and the other going right. Standing still, I suddenly heard a booming robotic voice calling me from invisible speakers. "You are the subject of an experiment. This is the labyrinth. If you get to the center, you will live." I gasped as raw panic pulsed through my body. My instincts and military training kicked in when I felt an intense heat behind me, turning to see a wall of flames advancing quickly down the hallway I had just walked down. My skin singed as I ran away from the fire, and I chose the hallway to my left as I ducked for cover. Fortunately, another shutter door slammed shut, trapping the wall of flames on the other side. I stood up and shook myself, relieved that I hadn't burned to ashes, but terrified by the hellish situation I found myself in. The maze, that's what the voice said. Get to the center, and you will live. I was a mouse in a maze, tormented by my still invisible tormentors. Of course, I didn't want to play their twisted games, but what choice did I have? Despite the hell my life had become, I wanted to live. I kept walking, moving deeper into the maze while keeping an eye out for traps. I descended through several narrow passages, all looking identical to the last. I had no idea if I was going in the right direction or not. Thinking back, I had no idea how big this maze was or how I would get to the center. As far as I knew, this was all just a twisted game planned by my captors, and they were simply toying with me. Fear was growing inside me, an illness rising from the pit of my stomach. Somehow, I knew something bad was coming, but I never could have guessed the threat I was about to face. I froze when I heard it, a low, animalistic growl coming from the hallway behind me. I turned slowly, seeing a monstrous shape in the shadows, and suddenly, the invisible speakers sounded and the same mechanical voice called me. "Know your competition. Only one of you will get out of here alive." I felt an icy chill as I watched the figure approach and saw the monster's true form in the dim light. The horror I witnessed was impossible but still real. There was a werewolf, or at least a close approximation of one. The beast stood over 6 feet tall, its muscular body covered in thick matted fur. When I looked at the beast's face, I was surprised to see that it had 3 pairs of eyes, all black and staring at me menacingly. But what really worried me were his thick claws and sharp teeth, saliva dripping from his mouth as he advanced. I stepped back, raising my hands defensively in a futile attempt to defuse the situation. Then the disembodied voice called out once more. Your competitor has an unfair physical advantage. Time to even the odds. Suddenly, a panel on the wall to my right opened to reveal a small storage area with a set of weapons hands contained in a support. Instinctively, I grabbed one machete and I faced the beast, bracing myself as the werewolf roared and charged towards me. My opponent was fast and I barely dodged the first attack, but I didn't escape unscathed when the beast's claws caught my side. I screamed in pain and shock, but the cut it wasn't deep, and so I stood up. Hitting with my machete, I returned the favor, the beast's back and forcing it to roar in agony. Poured from both sides, and I braced myself for the next attack, turning to face the wounded beast. I saw the anger in her 6 dark eyes and knew she wanted me. One of us would certainly be dead in a matter of seconds or so, I thought, but events would intervene. The beast was about to attack when we were hit by a powerful explosion as the wall itself was destroyed. The explosion threw me and my opponent to the ground. I hit my head on the cold metal walkway and was stunned for a moment. Slowly, I came to my senses and stood up, coughing and sputtering as I picked my way through the dust and debris. To my amazement, I saw a huge hole in the maze wall, quickly filled as a motley crew passed through the opening. I ducked and rolled into a protective ball as a multitude of bodies rushed past me in a mad dash. I saw a dozen or more pairs of feet looking up to see human bodies, most dressed in sparse robes or rags like me, while others were completely loose. Everyone was stirred into a frenzy, their eyes filled with mad rage and fiery determination. Most were armed with hand weapons, such as machetes or short swords, although some carried weapons advanced-looking fire weapon that I didn't recognize. A second later, a small but deadly machine war robotics floated through the newly created hole in the wall. The drone hovered above me, watching me with its built-in cameras and apparently deciding whether or not I constituted a threat. I froze, hoping to be at any moment, but then a hand reached out and helped me to my feet. I looked into my savior's eyes and saw a hint of compassion behind a hardened exterior. The young woman who helped me up looked like she had been through wars, his tense face and tired eyes. When I saw his skin, I noticed deep, barely healed scars and wondered what she had endured. In fact, all the humans present looked emaciated and had signs of in their bodies. And yet these people were far from defeated as they waved their weapons in the air and prepared for battle. "I don't understand," I muttered weakly. "Me either," the woman replied. "All I know is that we are free. Those Astri bastards tortured all of us and our friends. Now it's time for revenge." I didn't know who she was or what she meant, but I thought it would be better to stay with these guys than face an unknown enemy alone. The hovering robot seemed to be leading the crowd and gave its instructions in a monotone voice. "Follow me. I will guide us safely through the maze and to the next level." I felt a little more confident now that I had help, but in the chaos I had forgotten about my previous enemy, the 6-eyed werewolf, who had also survived the explosion and was now on his feet again, growling aggressively and blocking our path. I raised my machete and I prepared to fight, but the woman stopped me by placing a firm hand on my shoulder. "No," she said, "he's on our side." I looked at her completely perplexed, but the woman remained firm. "Just watch," she said. We backed away as the machine advanced towards the snarling werewolf, but instead of attacking, the drone communicated with the beast, speaking in what I assumed was the alien wolf's native language. It sounded to me like a series of unrecognizable grunts and growls. However, the werewolf responded to the communication in the same way, and its body language quickly changed from aggressive to relatively friendly. To my disbelief, the beast that had almost killed me moments before was now an ally. It made no sense, but I didn't dwell on the confusing situation, instead joining my new comrades as we followed our robotic guide and made our way down the cramped hallways. Before long, we came to a solid wall, and I feared we had made a wrong turn. But then the machine called to us, saying, "Stand aside." Raising its robotic arms, the machine shot 2 powerful rockets that crashed into the metal wall, demolishing it in a powerful explosion that knocked me down. Standing up, I followed the scrum as we ran through the newly created hole and emerged into a whole new level of hell. Leaving the so-called maze, we found ourselves inside a massive chamber that looked like some kind of docking dock, except the cargo were hundreds of prisoners held in stacked cages. So many scared humans with ugly shock collars strapped around their necks. But I barely had time to assimilate the horror when suddenly all the cages opened automatically and the collars fell from the prisoners' necks, freeing them all at once. Some were reluctant to leave their prisons, hesitating as if they thought they were being tricked. But others rushed out of their cages without hesitation, crying in fury as they jumped onto the metal walkway and armed themselves with whatever they could. Weapons that they could get their hands on. Most of the prisoners were human, but, to my utter astonishment, I saw other species among them, exotic aliens of various descriptions. There were several other werewolf-like creatures similar in appearance to the one I fought in the maze. There were other humanoid creatures too, some tall and hairless and others short, stocky and covered in thick fur. The most bizarre was a pink octopus-like being that slithered across the cold metal surface, using the suction cups on its tentacles to propel itself forward. Despite their differences, all the prisoners seemed united in their desire to escape and seek revenge against their captors. But who did this to us, and why? I didn't have time to reflect on this question, but I received an answer of sorts as the situation quickly escalated. A shrill alarm sounded throughout the chamber, and a moment later a shuttered door at the far end of the docking dock opened, revealing a platoon of monstrous alien soldiers who quickly joined the fray. "Astri!" my companion screamed, cold terror now evident in her voice. I watched in horror as 24 red-scaled reptilians armed with weapons of fire and spears of war. They spread out in military formation, their cold, predatory eyes filled with malice and the claws on their feet, snapping in anticipation as they attacked. The gunners attacked first, filling the chamber with needle-like bullets that literally tore through the chamber, humanity to pieces, massacring dozens and spilling its guts on the metal floor. Then the warriors wielding spears, they sprang into action, charging forward and attacking the escaping prisoners, impaling them or cutting their throats with their claws. "Come on," shouted the man. "We have to fight, otherwise they will all of us." Your cry of war, it was very effective as the crowd advanced with righteous fury, throwing themselves at the Astri soldiers in a desperate wave of violent attacks. The alien stormtroopers cut dozens, but still they came. The women and others used their weapons stolen to provide covering fire while mighty-wielding humans attacked the Astri. The captors were stronger and more resilient, but they did not have sufficient numbers. One by one, the Astri were overpowered and slaughtered by angry gangs of freed prisoners. In the midst of the bloody chaos, I saw the same werewolf I had previously fought jumping on top of an Astri soldier, ravaging the enemy soldier with his claws and teeth in a savage attack. I then witnessed the octopus-like being grab a weapon from the claws of another reptilian guard with one of his tentacles. It then attacked with a second appendage and choked the same Astri, crushing its skull in a deadly embrace. For a time I was paralyzed, watching in horrified amazement as the savage battle unfolded before my eyes. But I was brought back to reality when one of the reptilians charged at me, spear outstretched as he roared in fury. I reacted on pure instinct, using my own blade to parry the first attack. We fought for a few moments, struggling and dodging attacks. But Astri was bigger, stronger, and faster than me, so the alien soon gained the upper hand, knocking the weapon from my hand and forcing me to fall to the ground. The snarling beast was above me, holding his spear of war overhead as he prepared to deliver his killing blow. I closed my eyes and prepared myself for the death, but suddenly a number sounded. I looked up in time to see Astri's head explode in guts, his scaled body collapsing heavily onto the hard ground. Standing up, I turned around and saw my savior, the one from the labyrinth, who led the resistance. Once again, she extended her hand to help me up, which I gladly accepted. "Thanks," I murmured. "You are welcome," she said with a slight smile on her dry lips. "My name is Natasha, by the way." I smiled, recognizing the insanity of performing in the midst of this violent chaos. However, I responded in kind, saying, "Nice to meet you, Natasha. I'm Jamie." For a brief moment, we rediscovered some humanity amidst all the terror and anarchy, but the battle continued around us, and so there was no time for sentimentality. Now the Astri fighters were on the defensive, Most of them had been massacred while the last half dozen laid suppressive fire to cover their retreat. The attack against them was led by the same machine war who guided us through the labyrinth, shot up rockets at the enemy with ruthless efficiency. But the price paid for these gains was high, as the docking dock was covered in the bodies of humans and other species, the dock floor strewn with their tripe. I was saddened to see my old enemy among the dead, the six-eyed werewolf of the labyrinth. He fought valiantly, but was eventually shot down by a hail of bullets from Astri. In fact, almost all of the 12 fugitives who fought through the maze with us were dead. The carnage took its toll on Natasha and I, and we both stood there for a moment in stunned horror before a new voice called to us from the distance, shouting, "You two, here!" We turned to see a pale, emaciated, middle-aged man, dressed in white robes, standing in an open doorway and repeating his call, "Come here, fast, I can help you." We didn't know this man, but he was a human being, and so I decided we needed to trust him. Running, we ran through the bodies and made our way to the door, where we were greeted by the mysterious stranger. Our supposed savior waved us in before closing the door behind us. We found ourselves inside what looked like an elevator, a cramped steel container that rose automatically, taking us to higher levels and away from the fire-soaked combat zone. I relaxed during the temporary rest we enjoyed, but I couldn't do that for long. Natasha and I were quick to inspect our surroundings, noticing the stern-faced man who called out to us and invited us in, his eyes watching us intensely while his lips remained tightly closed. But what caught our attention was the creature that cowered behind him. I instinctively jumped when I saw him. A reptilian being similar to the Astri I had just seen, but also remarkably different. Its scales were a light brown instead of red. Furthermore, the creature was significantly smaller than an Astri, less than 5 feet tall, and was much less aggressive in nature. In fact, he or she had yellow eyes full of fear and anxiety, and I soon got the impression that he or she was more afraid of us than we were of him. I didn't believe this being posed any threat to us, but Natasha wasn't taking any chances. In one quick movement, she stood up and aimed her weapon alien and prepared to shoot. But to our immense surprise, the man in the white robe positioned himself in front of the weapon and shouted, "Don't hurt him! He's not Astri. This being is on our side." Natasha was shocked, but luckily she didn't pull the trigger, instead lowering her hand, and took a step back. We both looked at the strange pair in bewilderment, watching as the human reassured his reptilian companion, showing him what appeared to be sincere compassion. "Who are you?" I asked, confused. The man turned to us and nodded before responding. "My apologies. Let me make the necessary introductions. My name is Gideon. I have been a guest of the Astri for some time." He paused and turned to his brown-scaled reptilian companion before continuing. "And this is Abel, who I'm proud to call my friend." "Abel?" Natasha exclaimed in disbelief. Gideon smiled slightly before responding. "Yes, well, I'm afraid your real name is quite unpronounceable in our language. Instead, I named him after my late brother on Earth. I think of it as a sign of respect." I was no longer clear about who this strange little man was or what his relationship was to this strange creature. On the other hand, nothing that had happened since the beginning of this living nightmare made sense to me. I had received no real answers since the chaos in the maze, as my entire focus was on survival. Natasha had been here longer, however, and certainly knew more than me. She continued to look suspiciously at the nervous reptilian, as if she suspected a trap. "I didn't understand," she exclaimed. "If that thing isn't Astri, then what is? Another prisoner?" "Not exactly," Gideon replied thoughtfully. "It's hard to explain, but I'll try my best. But there's something else I need to show you first. It won't be an easy thing to witness, but unfortunately, it is necessary to experience the full extent of the horror before you can understand the truth." Natasha and I exchanged a look of cold terror as we considered the horrifying meaning behind Gideon's cryptic words. I was prepared to demand more answers, but a moment later our elevator stopped and the doors opened to reveal a horror beyond my worst nightmares. "Welcome to the Astri Temple of Pain, the pinnacle of their culture," Gideon said sternly as he and Abel entered. It's difficult for me to describe the interior of the Astri Temple, if that's the right word for it. The interior lighting was a dark shade of red, giving the chamber an ominous appearance at first glance. However, the entrance to the room was quite normal, consisting of what I imagined to be the alien equivalent of benches, places for Astri's worshippers to sit or kneel while participating in whatever twisted ceremonies took place within this hellish chamber. But it was impossible to ignore the vile centerpiece that adorned the far wall, standing above the pews in the same position one would expect to find a crucifix in a Christian church. Astri's equivalent was certainly the result of bad science, resulting in a distorted mosaic of skin and meat, all meticulously stitched together in a sickening display. I've already seen that's enough in my life to know that the horrific display was constructed from real human bodies, and the foul stench confirmed it to be so. And then there were the faces contained within the fleshy canvas. 13 human faces separated from their skulls and stitched into the infernal tapestry, their eyes closed, but mouths still open. Against my better judgment, I slowly walked down the hallway toward the disgusting idol, horrified by what I saw, but somehow unable to turn away from it. And then it happened. The faces suddenly came to life, their eyes opening all at once to reveal 13 lost souls, all long ago gripped by terror and madness. They stared at us, recognizing the presence of new victims to their existence, torturous. And then they opened their collective mouths to reveal the total darkness within. I don't know how they made noise through their non-existent throats, but suddenly they screamed as one, a bone-chilling wail, soul-destroying, that reverberated throughout the small temple, rising to a terrifying crescendo that forced me to cover my ears in a vain attempt to drown out the horror. Natasha rushed to my side, shouting, "Make it stop!" I looked at Gideon and Abel, who seemed quite calm during the terrible cacophony. Gideon nodded to his alien friend and shouted to be heard above the screams, "Time to end this!" Abel gently nodded and activated a control panel on the wall next to the skin mosaic, using his thin claw-like fingers to enter a command. We heard a beeping sound, and a moment later the scream stopped abruptly, the 13 pairs of eyes closing, and the disembodied faces falling. We sat for a moment of solemn silence before Gideon spoke softly, saying, "Finally, these poor souls are at peace." Natasha and I sat in shocked silence, unable to find the words to react to the savagery we had just witnessed. Once again, it fell to Gideon to offer an explanation of some kind. "You know, I used to believe that the Astri were invincible, that they were so superior to us, and that their cruelty was akin to a child sadist tearing off the wings of a fly. I'm embarrassed to admit that I once served them when I thought I had no other choice. I believed I deserved it to die as punishment for my complicity in their crimes, and that was almost my fate. But Abel was the one who rescued me moments before a burning." He paused, looking fondly at the strange lizard-like alien. "He was the one who showed me the truth and proved to me that our enemy can be defeated. After all, Abel's people know the Astri better than we ever could." I still did not get it. Natasha interrupted. "Who is he? And what the hell is all this?" Gideon nodded thoughtfully, looking at his alien companion before responding. "Yes, I suppose answers would be helpful. Our time is limited, so I will try to be concise. The true name of Abel's species was erased from history long ago, although I will refer to them as Gaians. Either way, they had the misfortune of evolving on the same planet as the Astri millions of years ago. The two races are similarly related to Homo sapiens and Neanderthals on Earth, except that both subspecies survived to establish their own independent civilizations. The Astri came from savage jungles, where they had to fight fierce predators for limited resources. Meanwhile, the Gaians lived on the more peaceful plains, valleys, and coastlines, where their civilization thrived. While the Gaians focused on science, culture, and enlightenment, the Astri developed into a cruel and warlike race that sought to resolve all disputes with violence. Abel's ancestors were certainly technologically superior to their planetary rivals, developing spaceflight when the Astri were still developing, with muskets and spears. They could have destroyed the wild Astri millennia ago and spared the galaxy centuries of pain and suffering. But unfortunately, the Gaians were a peaceful and trusting people, so they let them live. Gideon paused briefly, a faint smile on his lips, but a terrible sadness apparent in his tired eyes. You can probably guess what happened next. The Astri betrayed them, Natasha replied angrily. Correct, Gideon confirmed. They used brutal violence against their planetary rivals, committing near genocide while subjecting the survivors to permanent slavery. And the Astri also captured the Gaian spaceships and advanced technology, allowing them to finally expand their savage empire across the galaxy. I shook my head, as suddenly this nightmare was starting to make sense to me. But there were still so many unanswered questions. But why all this? I exclaimed as I pointed to the grotesque display of human faces now happily dead. What do they hope to achieve with all this cruelty? A very good question, Gideon replied thoughtfully as he met my gaze. It's a difficult question to answer. We humans also commit horrific atrocities, of course, both against our own species and against the animals with whom we share our planet. Yet at some level, most human beings know the distinction between right and wrong. This is not the case with the Astri. I'm afraid they no longer have a moral compass after millennia of war, savage, and intergalactic genocide. But it's more than that, isn't it? His violence and passion for torture have developed into a religion of sorts, a twisted cult built on the pain and suffering of its many victims. At least that's what I thought, but now I see the truth. The Astri are not the galactic master race they claim to be. Their power is based on the terror they inflict on their victims, but they are nowhere near as strong as we have been led to believe. That's why Abel and I created the necessary conditions for this rebellion. We will take this slave ship from the enemy and send a message to the galaxy. They need to know that the Astri's days are numbered. I noticed the passion that entered Gideon's voice as he spoke those last words, and I wondered what hellish personal journey he had been on to get to this point. There were more questions I wanted to ask, but there was no time. Abel typed more digits into the control panel before walking over to his human friend and whispering in his ear. Before long, Gideon shared the latest with us. The battle is almost over, he proclaimed, but there is little reason for celebration. Unfortunately, casualties among the prisoners were very high, but our rebellion was successful. You members of Astri have been defeated, and all that remains is for us to take the bridge. From there, Abel can take control of the ship and take us home. Let's go now. I shook my head in disbelief, looking at Natasha, who seemed to share my confusion. Could it be that simple? Were we really going home? I didn't know what to believe, but it seemed we had little choice but to trust the enigmatic Gideon and follow his plan. And besides, we had no desire to spend any more time in this sick temple of death. Gideon and Abel led the way, exiting the chamber through yet another hidden door and leading us through a dark maze of winding corridors that seemed to be the norm within this shadowy Astri spaceship. Before long, we arrived at another door that led to an elevator. The always resourceful Abel summoned the elevator and we entered, ascending to another level within this enormous ship. As soon as we got out of the elevator, we came face to face with the survivors of battle, a motley crew of brutalized but defiant humans, peppered with various members of various alien species. They had little in common with each other, and even humans might have been mortal enemies on Earth. But old rivalries didn't matter now. They had all been abducted from their homes and even removed from their own planets by a savage alien race that inflicted torture unspeakable about them. However, as soon as the opportunity arose, they fought bravely and fiercely, winning against all odds. And yet there was no joy in their eyes, only sadness and pain after everything they had lost. But still, his work was not yet done, and there was one last barrier to be broken before a final victory could be achieved. We made our way through the silent crowd and saw the heavy steel door that I guessed was the entrance to the ship's bridge. We fell far behind, while what I assumed was the same machine who saved me from the maze flew forward, positioning himself carefully before bombarding the barrier with high-speed rockets, causing a powerful explosion that nearly lifted us off our feet. I shielded my eyes from the explosion, waiting for the dust to settle before observing the substantial hole opened by the previously impenetrable door. I was still apprehensive, feeling that the ship's bridge was unsafe, but Abel cautiously proceeded inside, his claws clicking on the cold metal as he went. Gideon soon followed, and the crowd of freed prisoners were next. Natasha and I exchanged one more look before she said, "After you." The bridge was brighter and more elaborate than the other sections of the ship we had seen, adorned with control panels and monitors whose functions I couldn't even begin to understand. Abel, however, seemed very familiar with Astri technology, which I suppose wasn't surprising given that this technology had already been stolen from his people. But unfortunately, there was another tragic twist to come. The last surviving Astri may have been the ship's captain or a senior officer. I guess we'll never know for sure. What seems certain is that he remained hidden inside the control room, patiently waiting for his prey and the opportunity for revenge. The predator moved quickly, and before anyone had the chance to react, he pulled out a pistol and shot. The bullet hit Abel right in the head and blew his brains out all over the control panel. Gideon responded with grief and raw anger upon witnessing his friend's death, screaming in fury as he recklessly charged at the warrior Astri, only to be hit for a second number, his body thrown back by the powerful force of the impact. At that moment, the crowd was consumed by righteous anger, advancing as one in a relentless assault on the Astri. He shot in one and another two with his claws before the angry prisoners overpowered him, knocking the alien down and brutally stabbing him with their blades. Then the bath. It ended when the reptilian lay dead on the cold metal floor, hit by 100. However, we paid no attention to the monster, instead rushing to the side of our injured companion Gideon, who was now sprawled against the wall, with oozing from a bullet wound in his belly. He whispered in sadness as his face turned pale, saying, "I lost another brother. So, it was all in vain." And here we are, the last survivors of a prisoner rebellion in control of an alien ship on the edge of our solar system. Poor Gideon managed to communicate limited instructions to us before he lost consciousness, providing enough information for us to transmit this SOS message across space. But we have no idea how to pilot this huge ship, and so we are adrift in the cold vacuum, slowly waiting for death. I cannot accept that this is the end of our story, however. My comrades and I, human and non-human, have fought too hard and suffered too much to simply give up. I learned a lot about the enemy, but also about our Earth-based government's complicity in their atrocities. There are those among us who remember being handed over to the Astri by other human beings, given over to evil by traitors to our own kind. Our transmission may very well reach Earth, but we know that no help will come from there. But we hear rumors of a third party, a galactic confederation that rises to protect those brutalized and by the monsters of this cruel universe. And so, we hope against hope that our bill reaches these intergalactic saviors. If you're listening, you must reach us before the enemy does, and together we can lead to war to the cowardly Astri and end her reign of terror once and for all. I repeat, SOS, please send help. You are our last hope.